Which of the following categories would you put these tinders into? Good, bad, or just temporarily out of order? Keep watching and you'll see the innovative method we discovered for utilizing wet tinders. I'm Luke, this is Wilderness Strong, and lately we've been all about wet weather fire making. So far we've covered cedar trees and dry rot as fantastic go-tos, and two of the best resources for getting a fire going in the rain. But we are also strong believers in practicing worst-case scenarios, practicing wilderness survival using all kinds of what-if situations and materials, especially with fire making. So we set out on a discovery mission to see what was possible to achieve using soaking wet tinders. The wilderness doesn't always present us with the best circumstances, so we like to be prepared by practicing in poor conditions with the worst materials. So welcome to the worst. Winter in the Pacific Northwest gives us ample opportunity to practice worst-case scenarios, and we like to start at the bottom sometimes and find right where that line is between impossible and just doable. We're not saying that any of what you're about to see is preferable, but here's what we learned is possible. Now, of course, being truly prepared means that you would already have packed in some reliable fire starter before your adventure even began. But that's not what this experiment was all about. It was all about the worst-case scenarios. So when we set out, we put ourselves in a realistic scenario, which was to be traveling from one destination to another in the daylight, in wet conditions, knowing that when dark came, it would be crucial to get a fire going. We started in the morning and had off and on rain throughout the experiment, which did not make things any easier, thankfully. And we thought about one of the most common mistakes that many fire makers make, which is to hike all the way to their location and then at that moment begin collecting materials for their fire, racing the sunset with no prior knowledge that their destination is even going to have materials that they need. When we're heading to a new location, regardless of the weather conditions, we're always in the habit of just grabbing a handful of this or that as we hike along. Just enough tinder to fill a pocket or a pouch gives us a reliable starting point that can make all the difference once we get to camp. But we asked ourselves, what if we didn't already have dry tinder, and what if all these handfuls that we're used to grabbing along the way were dripping, sopping, sloppy, wet handfuls? How could we dry these out before nightfall? How fast could we do it? What could be done to dry these wet materials that would otherwise have made effective and optimal tinders? Well, without heat from the sun and without fire, of course, there was only one tried and true drying method left to put our hopes in: airflow. But we didn't have this nice flowing breeze to work with, so we had to get a bit creative, and we'll show you in just a second what we did. First, let's cover some of these sloppy materials that we chose to work with. Usnea, or old man's beard. This is a smolder tinder that we've used reliably in the past, but it's not looking so reliable on this day, so we really didn't know what would happen with this one. Nettle, of course. I mean, how could we walk past this old friend and not include him in the experiment? Dead, wet grass growing along the river. I mean, we know how quick this stuff would go up with a match if it was dry, so we'll see if we can get it dry, or dry enough. Cottonwood. We really want this one to work. Dry cottonwood bark can be easily peeled thin and used for tinder, but this stuff we picked up was not having its best day. Now, we also decided to include a couple of more promising tinders that were up off the ground and already benefiting from some moderate airflow. These are just the blades being picked off the dead grass, and dead bracken fern, which, although wet, is very light and hopefully quick to dry in our experiment. Before we actually start drying out these tinders, we knew we'd need a cord. Of course, a prepared person would already have a cord. But again, this is not a preparation video. This is about worst case scenario. So having no cord on hand, we decided to make one using 9-bark. 9-bark was used anciently for many things, including arrows, children's bows, and knitting needles. But I have to wonder, was it ever used the way we're about to use it? Maybe not, but possibly. Okay, with our cord made, here's the plan. Take the wet materials we gathered, wring them out, separate them, process them a bit, and tie them to the cord. Dangle them off of our pack, swing them through the air, carry them at our side while we're hiking. Just speed up the process of what would eventually happen to them anyway from natural airflow. Honestly, with only a few hours left until dark, we really didn't know if this would work. But we knew for sure that if we did nothing to these materials, they'd still be just as wet at dark as they were sitting in our wet hands. So here's how it went. So we didn't swing these things around non-stop for hours, just periodically as we hiked along. Sometimes we'd just carry them or tie them to our packs or hang them from a limb if we stopped for a break. We just wanted to keep them off the ground and out of the rain. Now, just a quick personal confession here. More than once as I watched my dad doing this, I almost laughed out loud for some reason. Maybe it was because I'd seen him accomplish so many dramatic and impressive feats in the wild throughout my life that it just struck me funny to see him twirling this wet tinder around. Or maybe it's just that he seemed so content doing it and actually made it look like fun. Or maybe it's because of how impressed I've always been that no detail was ever too small for him or beneath him when it came to wilderness survival. And it just might be that yet again, one of his creative ideas was going to work right in front of me. Whatever the reason for my amusement, I really enjoyed the anticipation of seeing what these once soaking wet tinders could do after just a few hours of swinging. Now, you remember the soaking wet grass that we picked up. Well, it was still what we'd call somewhat damp, but look what happened with one match. It was definitely being stubborn at first, but we wouldn't take no for an answer. We also need to point out that this was only doable because the grass was being lifted off the ground and rotated, keeping the grass and moisture from compacting on the ground and cutting off the airflow. Now, we actually had very high hopes for the nettle, and it did not disappoint, of course. Nettle is a smoldering tinder, possibly the best we've ever seen, so once we dropped an ember in there, it did what nettle does: smolder, get hot, and eventually ignite our kindling, which was a little bit less than optimal. Considering how much water came wringing out of this usnea, I definitely had my doubts about whether or not it could do the job. We used somewhat dry shavings from a fir branch here, but we also believed that usnea could have held on long enough to ignite even less ideal kindling. Now, to me at least, the bracken fern was probably the biggest surprise, and not in a good way. It was mixed with the grass, and it was successful, but just barely. It's interesting how sometimes in wilderness survival, the materials you think will perform the best actually struggle to get the job done in a given situation. But that's exactly why we practice. I've made no secret about how much I love cottonwood trees, so we saved it for last year, and I could not have been more proud of this cottonwood bark and the overall results of our wet tinder drying experiment. If you want to see way more efficient fire starting methods than this for wet weather, check out these two videos, and don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. Wilderness Strong is all about bushcraft, nature, ethnobotany, and wilderness survival. We'll see you all in the next one.